Welcome to Velvet Crimes. I am Dr. John Watson, your narrator, and tonight I recount a case that still unsettles me. It began with a mirror standing in its place, yet offering no reflection to those who gazed into it. From that impossible silence of glass emerged a puzzle that confounded reason and drew Holmes into one of his most unnerving investigations. Tonight's tale is the mirror that refused to reflect. Before we begin, recall Holmes's lesson. What seems inexplicable often hides its answer in the simplest observation. Tell me, what detective do you admire most? If mysteries cloaked in shadow intrigue you, like this video and subscribe to join the investigation. Now settle yourself and let the case begin. It was on a pale March morning in the year 1891, the sort of morning where London's fog clung to the streets like gauze to a wound, that I found Sherlock Holmes seated cross-legged upon the rug of our Baker Street sitting room, his gaze fixed upon a broken piece of mirror propped on the mantel. He had been there since before dawn, so Mrs. Hudson informed me, murmuring intermittently, refusing both tea and toast and, most alarming of all, not once reaching for his pipe. The only accompaniment to this curious vigil was a letter, its seal already broken, and the paper spread flat on the floor like a crime scene. "Watson," he said without turning, "tell me, what do you make of this mirror?" I blinked, still tugging off my gloves. "Well, it is cracked down the centre, perhaps dropped by a careless hand. Quite useless now," Holmes sniffed disdainfully. "Useless to those seeking vanity, but not to those seeking truth." He finally rose, long limbs unfolding like a marionette newly animated, and swept the note into my hands. The paper was of thick cream stock, monogrammed with the initials ASC embossed in gilt. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate, with a trace of distress evident in the hurried downward strokes. "Mr. Holmes, I beg your immediate assistance. A mirror in my possession has refused to reflect the image of a man standing directly before it, twice. Once, it was I. The second time, it was my brother. The glass is whole. No trick, no gimmick. Scotland Yard laughs, my physician blames nerves. But I know what I saw. If this matter is of no interest to you, then I fear I shall soon be of no interest to anyone. Algernon Swithin Carmody, Carmody House, Mayfair." I looked up, incredulous. "Surely this is the ravings of a disturbed man, or a hoax, Holmes." Holmes' lips curled. "You would not be the first to say so. But riddle me this. Why would a wealthy solicitor with a reputation for stability and a disdain for theatricality stake his dignity on such an absurdity?" "No, Watson. There's something deeper, something twisted beneath the polished surface." He tossed me my coat and reached for his cane, the one with the hollow shaft. Carmody House, nestled in a discreet crescent off Grosvenor Square, was an estate of considerable elegance. But as our hansom approached, I felt a peculiar weight descend upon the street, as though the fog here did not merely obscure but cloaked something wilfully hidden. A man awaited us on the doorstep, dressed immaculately in a grey morning coat and cravat. He was pale, his eyes sunken, and his hands trembled despite the relative warmth of the hour. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he greeted us. "You have no idea how relieved I am." "I'm Algernon Carmody Holmes," offered only a slight nod. "Take us to the mirror, sir." I prefer not to have my reason prejudiced by description. Carmody led us through a velvet-draped hallway and up a mahogany staircase to a second-floor study. "There," he said, gesturing. It was indeed a beautiful mirror, tall, beveled, and framed in deep green marble. It stood mounted above an ornate sideboard, facing a set of tall windows through which weak sunlight now filtered. "Would you be so kind, Watson?" Holmes gestured. I stepped before the mirror. It reflected me exactly as expected. Holmes stepped forward, the same. And then Mr. Carmody moved into place. I admit, dear reader, my heart slowed for a beat, for as he stepped before the mirror, there was nothing. The velvet curtains behind him, the frame itself, yes. But no reflection of Carmody, just empty air where his figure should be. He staggered back. "You see it!" "I am not mad." Holmes's eyes gleamed, but his voice was measured. "Indeed, I see what I was told I would see," which is not the same thing as seeing the truth. Carmody looked as though he might collapse, but Holmes, hands clasped behind his back, turned toward the windows. "Tell me, Mr. Carmody, you mentioned your brother experienced this as well?" "Yes, Horace. 2 nights ago he too. He vanished from the glass. It frightened him terribly. And this morning I received word. He's gone. Disappeared from his home in Brighton. Disappeared. Left no note. No luggage taken. Servants said he had locked his study and never came out. When the door was forced, he was simply not there." Holmes nodded slowly, pacing. "Has this mirror always been in this room?" "No," Carmody said, swallowing. "Well, it was delivered 3 weeks ago, part of a collection I purchased at an estate auction. Came from a place in Cornwall. A manor under demolition." Holmes turned sharply. "And you've had no, shall we say, disturbances before its arrival?" Carmody hesitated. "Well," he admitted, "my dog whines at it constantly. Refuses to enter the room, and once I thought I heard whispering. But that could have been wind." Holmes knelt beside the mirror, peering at the lower edge. Then he produced a lens from his coat pocket and examined the marble inlay. "Watson, note the faint residue here, a powdery film, barely perceptible, almost luminescent." I bent down. "Phosphor? Or something more exotic," he murmured. "There is craft here, possibly chemical, possibly optical, or more clever still." He rose and stared directly into the glass. "What one does not reflect may not be missing, Watson, but misdirected." I watched as Holmes tapped the frame in 4 quick strokes, then gripped the edge and twisted. With a soft click, a portion of the mirror detached, revealing a hidden cavity behind it. Inside lay a small box lined with velvet. Within the box, a pair of ornate spectacles and a folded letter. Holmes did not touch them. He turned to Carmody. "Sir, I suggest you fetch your butler and your solicitor. Whatever this is, it's no trick of the light." Carmody swayed, then nodded. Watson leaned close. "Holmes, this mirror, do you believe it's meant to hide something, or show something?" Holmes replied softly, "That, my dear Watson, is precisely what I intend to find out. For mirrors may lie, but not without help." He gave a final glance to the hidden box, then added with a frown, "And I would wager this one has seen more than it has shown." Holmes stood utterly still, arms behind his back, and his gaze fixed on the narrow, velvet-lined compartment now open within the mirror's housing. Outside the tall windows of Carmody House, the mist had thickened once more, lending the room a dreamlike pallor, as if even the daylight feared to intrude upon what we had uncovered. The hidden cache contained 2 items, a folded letter on yellowed parchment, and a pair of spectacles with circular lenses slightly tinted in a peculiar violet hue. Their frame was not gold nor silver, but a dark, brushed metal I did not recognize, more industrial than refined, yet surprisingly elegant. Carmody returned moments later with his butler, a spare man with a long face and suspicious eyes, and his solicitor, a nervous-looking gentleman whose mutton chop whiskers twitched every time he glanced toward the mirror. "I shall require you both as witnesses," Holmes said briskly. for I intend to examine this letter, and I have no interest in being accused of tampering with your employer's affairs." "I trust Mr. Holmes implicitly," Carmody interjected, but Holmes raised a gloved hand. "Even implicit trust benefits from clarity, sir. Now then, Watson, if you would." With deliberate care, I reached in and retrieved the folded paper. It bore no seal, only the initials A.L. in faded ink on the back. I handed it to Holmes, who unfolded it slowly, letting the light fall upon the page. The handwriting was jagged and uneven, the ink smeared in places as though written in haste or fear. He read aloud, "To he who discovers this, beware. The mirror is not a window, but a door. Its reflection is not your own, but another's, a shadow that watches and waits. Do not wear the lenses, do not listen when it speaks your name. It sees only those it chooses, and once chosen, you are no longer alone. My name was Alaric Linthorne. I was its keeper. I failed. Astit a silence fell so complete that we could hear the ticking of a long, unwound clock on the mantel. Carmody's solicitor cleared his throat nervously. "What sort of mad gibberish is that?" But Holmes' expression had hardened. "Not gibberish," he said softly. "It's a confession. Or perhaps a warning encoded in the language of a man skirting the edge of reason." He lifted the spectacles from the compartment and turned them over in his hands. "These are remarkably constructed. The lenses are not glass. See here, Watson, under the light." I stepped forward. Indeed, the surface shimmered faintly, not merely reflecting light, but seeming to refract it oddly, twisting the colours at the edges like oil on water. Holmes made no move to put them on. Instead, he walked to the windows and peered through the lenses, holding them away from his face. "What do you see?" I asked. "Nothing remarkable," he said, though his voice was cautious. "But the tint, it filters something, not just light, perhaps frequency. These are not spectacles in the traditional sense. I'd wager they are designed to reveal something invisible to the naked eye or to obscure it." Carmody, though pale, spoke with urgency. "Mr. Holmes, what am I to do?" "My brother has vanished. This mirror has turned my own image into a spectre, and now I am told it is a doorway to where." "That," Holmes said, "is precisely what we must determine." He motioned for Carmody's solicitor. "Have you the purchase records for this mirror and the other items from the estate sale?" Yes," the man stammered. "They're downstairs in my case." "Fetch them. And be quick." As the solicitor retreated, Holmes turned to the butler. "Have any staff entered this room after the mirror was installed? Any strange occurrences beyond the dog's behaviour?" The man shook his head. "None, sir. I dust the room every morning. But I'll not lie, I do so quickly. There's a feel to this room now, sir, like being watched by something with no eyes." Holmes made a noise deep in his throat, something between acknowledgement and grim amusement. Then he looked at me. "Watson, you are wondering whether this case has already taken a supernatural turn." "Well, yes," I admitted. "It's not every day a mirror refuses to reflect a living man." "And yet," Holmes replied, "we must always begin with the assumption that the world is rational. The impossible is only the improbable not yet explained." He turned back to the mirror, now oddly inert with the hidden compartment open and the warning exposed. "I am not prepared to attribute this to occult forces," he went on, "but I am prepared to believe that this mirror may have been part of a greater design, an elaborate deception or psychological experiment perhaps, or a tool for surveillance." "Surveillance?" I repeated. "In a mirror?" "Think, Watson," he said, eyes narrowing. "If I wished to frighten or manipulate a person, what better way than through the subtle manipulation of what they believe they see? If the mirror does not reflect them, they question their sanity. If it hides a compartment with ominous artifacts, they believe in curses. If it's from a distant, crumbling estate with no return address, all the better. The solicitor returned with a thick sheaf of documents. Holmes took them with a curt nod and rifled through the first few. "Ah, yes, Linthorne Hall, Cornwall, auction handled by Croft and Fennell, antiquities brokers. And here we are. The mirror is listed among a lot described as parapsychological curiosities, sold as is." "Linthorne," I echoed. That was the name signed in the letter. "Alaric Linthorne." "Indeed," said Holmes, eyes glittering. "We now have a name, a place, and a provenance. And tomorrow we shall have a train ticket. Pack warm clothing, Watson. We are going to Cornwall." Carmody blanched. "You're leaving? But what about the mirror? What about my brother?" "I do not believe your brother is dead," Holmes said, fastening the buttons of his coat. "Nor do I believe this mirror is cursed." He paused. "But I do believe someone has gone to great lengths to ensure you believe both." With that, he turned on his heel and strode out of the room, the mirror catching the light behind him. As I followed, I could not help but glance back. It reflected me perfectly, but I could have sworn, for the briefest flicker of a second, that something else moved behind my shoulder, something that was not there when I turned to look. Our journey to Cornwall was undertaken with the usual economy of language from Holmes and the usual surplus of conjecture from me. The countryside beyond the train's frosted windows passed in spectral blurs, hedgerows and empty fields drifting past like the half-remembered scenery of a dream. Holmes, seated opposite me in the first-class compartment, was uncommonly silent, his fingertips pressed together, his gaze fixed on the floor with the intensity of a chess master reading invisible positions. At length, I could bear the silence no longer. "You truly believe Algernon Carmody is being manipulated?" I asked. Holmes didn't look up. "Manipulated or tested, the line between psychological pressure and deception is often razor-thin, Watson. Consider the facts. A mirror from a demolished estate arrives bearing hidden spectacles and a cryptic note. The mirror refuses to reflect its owner. His brother vanishes. These are not random occurrences, they are staged sequences. Staged by whom?" "That," Holmes said, finally raising his eyes, "is what we must discover. Linthorne Hall may provide more than its share of ghosts, whether metaphorical or otherwise." We arrived at the small coastal village of Penharrow just past 4 o'clock. The sea air was bracing, tinged with the briny scent of kelp and the quiet rot of centuries. Our cabman, a leathery-faced man named Jarvis, agreed to take us up to Linthorne Hall with visible reluctance. "Nothing up there now but birds and stones, gentlemen," he muttered as the horses began their ascent up a winding, rutted lane. "Place has been under demolition since the owner passed 2 years back. No one's lived there since. Locals say the land don't want tenants." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "A curious sentiment for land to be so opinionated." The cabman did not laugh. Linthorne Hall came into view just as the sun began to lower itself into the western sea. The structure was mostly intact, though parts of the east wing had clearly suffered the wrecking ball's kiss. Tumbled stones, broken masonry, and the ragged guts of the roof lay in heaps like the spilled entrails of some architectural beast. Yet the main hall still stood proud, if tired. Ivy strangled the walls and seagulls circled the crumbling turrets. The iron gates, chained but rusted through, gave easily under Holmes's shoulder. "Stay here," Holmes instructed the cabman. "We shall return before dusk unless the land itself objects." Inside, the hall was still, a cathedral of shadows and echoes. The great foyer bore the marks of dismantling, stair rails missing, chandeliers removed, and several paintings half wrenched from their frames. Yet a palpable weight hung in the air, as if something remained behind, something that ought to have departed with the furniture, but had chosen to linger. We pressed forward. Holmes consulted a sketch map acquired from Carmody's solicitor, tracing the layout toward what had once been the West Gallery. "This is where the curio room was located," he murmured. Alaric Linthorne's collection of metaphysical nonsense. He dabbled in the occult, or so the estate records suggest, mesmerism, optics, and Egyptian glassware, among other indulgences. We entered the chamber. Dust cloaked everything like ash after a fire. Glass-fronted cabinets stood open and empty, their shelves warped with moisture. But the most striking object was a large metal platform in the center of the room, a sort of dais with bolts at the corners and grooves cut into the surface in intricate looping spirals. Holmes crouched beside it. "Interesting," he said, running a finger along one groove. "Not merely decoration. This is designed for wiring, likely electrical, a crude staging mechanism perhaps used in conjunction with mirrors or lenses. And note the ceiling, see the mounting brackets." I looked up. Indeed, there were iron arms affixed to the joists, some still holding fragments of chain. "A suspended mirror?" I guessed. "Possibly." Or something even more theatrical. Projection, perhaps. He stood, brushing his coat. If Linthorne was trying to build a device to simulate alternate reflection or disappearance, this would be the place. We split, to explore the adjoining rooms. I wandered through a narrow corridor lined with faded wallpaper and portraits whose eyes seemed to follow the light. One door, slightly ajar, led into what appeared to be a private study. Papers littered the desk. Most had succumbed to mildew, but one remained intact beneath the protective weight of a glass decanter. I called Holmes, who entered swiftly and scanned the contents. "Not Linthorne's handwriting," he said after a glance, "but recent, weeks old." He read aloud. "They warned me not to return, but I had to see it once more. The experiment was incomplete. It doesn't just reflect, it listens, waits. It speaks when you're alone. I wore the lenses again, saw the figures beyond the mirror, shapes, observing. They weren't distorted, they were accurate, but not from this side. I fear I am being watched, not through the mirror, but from behind it." He folded the note. "Watson, we're dealing with a deliberate construction. A manipulation of light and perception so finely tuned, it borders on the supernatural, yet I remain convinced of a logical explanation." "Who wrote this?" "Someone who returned after the sale. Possibly the missing brother, Horace Carmody, or another collector." Holmes opened the desk drawers with swift precision, finally extracting a leather-bound journal, its edges charred. "Look here," he said. "Entries dated last year. Mentions a spectral interface test. Not merely optical trickery, Watson. Linthorne was attempting something grander. These entries reference perceptual dissonance through reflection vectors, which means, in plain English, he believed the mirror could create the illusion of presence or absence depending on angle, light, and—" he held up the violet spectacles, "filtered vision." Suddenly from the far side of the hall, a sound broke the silence, a soft, deliberate click. We froze, and then came a voice, muffled, distant, yet unmistakably spoken aloud. It issued not from above nor below, but from within the walls themselves. "Alaric, you left us unfinished." Holmes was already moving, lantern held high as we returned to the central gallery. The air had grown inexplicably cold. A door we had not opened now stood ajar. We entered carefully. The room was small, bare, but in the far corner stood a cracked mirror, its frame identical to the one in Carmody House. Holmes approached it slowly, and though we both stood before it, it reflected only me. The cracked mirror in the corner of the chamber stared back at me. Only me. Holmes, though standing just to my right, was nowhere in the glass. It reflected the soot-streaked walls, the hanging remnants of a once rich tapestry, the slant of evening light slicing across the floor. But not Holmes. I felt my throat tighten. "Holmes," I said quietly, "you've vanished again." He didn't flinch. Instead, he narrowed his eyes at the mirror, stepped closer and tilted his head slightly, testing the angle. "No," he murmured, "not vanished. Excluded." He extended a hand, reaching into the line of reflection. "Watch carefully, Watson. What do you see now?" His hand, gloved, familiar, entered my field of view, and yet in the mirror there was nothing. No ripple, no ghostly echo. It simply did not exist in that pane of glass. I took a step back. "I dislike this, Holmes." Deeply, he turned to me, his expression unreadable. "And that, my dear Watson, is precisely the point. Whoever constructed this was not aiming for amusement or artistic illusion. This was built to unsettle, to manipulate. And I suspect it is far from finished." I swallowed hard and turned away from the glass. "What do you think it means that it shows only me?" Holmes was silent for a moment. "I believe," he said at last, "that it shows only the observer whom it selects, or rather, whom it chooses to permit." The absence of my reflection suggests the mirror's design has an interactive function. It isn't simply defective, it is responsive. We examined the mirror's frame. Though dust-caked and chipped, the edges revealed the faint glint of embedded copper wire. Holmes followed its trace downward into the floorboards. "Same wiring pattern as the dais in the curio room," he muttered. "See the burn marks here?" This mirror was once part of a larger circuit, powered, possibly controlled remotely. To what end? I asked. What purpose could a mirror like this serve? Holmes didn't reply immediately. He stood, thoughtful, and finally spoke in a tone that sent a chill up my spine. Surveillance, control, psychological warfare, or perhaps it was intended as a test. A test? Imagine it, Watson. A man looks into a mirror and finds he is not there. Days later, his brother vanishes. Letters speak of observation from beyond. You begin to question your sanity, your senses, your reality. That level of disruption in the right hands can break a man. He knelt beside the mirror's base and tapped gently. A hollow tone rang out. "Help me," he said. "We'll remove the mirror from its mount." "I want to see what lies behind it." We heaved the thing forward together, gingerly easing it from its position. Behind it, a square cut into the plaster revealed a shallow cavity in the wall. Inside lay a rusted metal housing, a kind of recess with a narrow funnel that led into the brickwork beyond. A strange, cone-shaped tube extended from its rear like the horn of a phonograph. Holmes studied it for a long moment. "This is no ordinary housing," he said. "It's not merely reflective. It's acoustic. Do you mean to say it records sound?" "More likely it channels it," Holmes replied. "A primitive listening device. The mirror is not only a visual deception, it's designed to hear." I stared at the strange apparatus. Good God! Someone could stand behind this wall and listen undetected exactly. Perhaps even respond whisperback, with the right mechanism, which means, Holmes said grimly, that the voice we heard earlier, Alaric, you left us unfinished, was not supernatural. He stood, brushing plaster dust from his coat. Someone was here. Recently, suddenly there was a thump from deeper in the house, a door slamming, a floorboard creaking. We froze. Holmes reached into his coat and drew a small revolver, his trusted Webley, and motioned for silence. We crept through the corridor and emerged into the darkened main hall, our footsteps echoing unnaturally beneath the high ceiling. "Did you leave the front door ajar, Watson?" Holmes asked without turning. "No," I said tightly. We reached the vestibule to find the door wide open, the twilight spilling inside. Our cab was gone, only wheel tracks in the gravel remained. Holmes stared into the gloom, unmoved. Either Jarvis grew tired of waiting, or someone encouraged him to depart. Behind us, the floor creaked again, slowly, deliberately. Holmes wheeled around, lantern raised high. "Show yourself." Nothing answered. But there, on the stairs, a dark shape stood at the top landing, motionless. A man, tall and thin, clad in what looked to be a frock coat. His features were obscured by the angle of the light, but I caught the glint of something metal in his hand. "Holmes!" I started. But in that instant the figure turned and vanished into the east wing. Holmes didn't hesitate. We pursued him, up the staircase and through the broken threshold of the demolished wing. Masonry crunched beneath our feet. Dust clouded the air. The corridor was narrow and partially collapsed. We followed the sound of footfalls, clumsy, urgent, until they vanished entirely. "He must have doubled back," I said, winded. Holmes crouched and examined the floor. "No," he murmured. "The prints continue straight into this wall." I stared, but there's no door. Holmes pressed the wall, then smiled faintly. Yet the wall rings hollow. There's a hidden passage, likely used by Linthorne himself to observe his guests or escape uninvited attention. He straightened. "We'll return in the morning with better light." Whoever that was, they did not want us here tonight. "And you think it's the same person who watched from behind the mirror?" "I suspect so," Holmes said. "And I now believe they've been observing more than just Carmody." He looked at me. "They're watching us, Watson." A gust of cold air blew through the corridor. In the distance, faint but undeniable, came the sound of glass shattering. The sound of shattering glass echoed like a pistol crack through the hollow corridors of Linthorne Hall. Holmes and I froze, listening for further movement, but only silence answered us, thick, expectant, unnaturally still. The cold was sharper now, more immediate, as though the house itself had drawn in its breath. "It came from the west gallery," Holmes said, turning at once. "Back to the curio room." We retraced our steps with haste, our lantern's flicker bouncing wildly along the warped floorboards and cracked plaster. When we reached the curio chamber, the air was tinged with dust and, yes, something sharper. I stepped forward and saw it at once. The mirror we had examined hours earlier, the one built into the gallery wall, lay in shards across the floor, its green marble frame tilted forward at a grotesque angle. It had not fallen by accident. The supports had been violently wrenched from the studs, and in the dust beside the debris were footprints, distinct, deliberate, fresh. One set, bare feet. Holmes examined them with a furrowed brow. The pattern is consistent with a man walking heel to toe, no shoes, likely indoors for some time. See here. Powder residue from the marble. He stepped through the broken frame. I stared. "You think he came out of the mirror?" Holmes looked up sharply. "Of course not. But someone wants us to believe that he knelt beside the largest mirror shard and examined it from various angles." "Watson," he murmured, "do you recall how Carmody described his brother's last moments?" "Locked in his study, no sign of departure, and then simply gone." "Yes," I said slowly. "And now we see a mirror designed to hide passages, audio mechanisms, wiring, and an intruder whose feet leave no trace beyond this room." He stood and dusted off his coat. "The simplest explanation, though no less chilling, is that this house is riddled with hidden exits. You think the man we saw used them to appear and vanish at will?" I suspect, Holmes said, he never truly vanished, only stepped from one illusion into another. He turned to a half-collapsed bookshelf and tugged aside a panel. Behind it was a recess in the wall, deep, narrow, and pitch black. "Another tunnel," he murmured. "Linthorne Hall is more than an estate. It's a stage, a theatre for shadows." At that moment, a faint tap, tap, tap echoed from the ceiling above, slow, rhythmic, as though someone were pacing directly overhead. We stared upward. A plume of dust drifted down from a cracked beam. "Someone is watching us," Holmes said, "not from within the mirror, but from around it." We made camp that night in the great foyer, taking turns keeping watch. The wind rattled through broken shutters and lifted the torn edges of rotting wallpaper. I tried to read, but the echo of footsteps, real or imagined, repeated endlessly in my ears. At some point, perhaps near midnight, Holmes stood and crossed silently to the remaining half of the shattered mirror. He held the violet spectacles up to his eyes. His body tensed at once. I stood. "What is it?" He did not answer immediately. Then, "Watson, look through these. Tell me what you see." I took them and adjusted them over my own eyes. The world at first shimmered in strange hues, everything tinted purple-blue and slightly distorted. But as I turned toward the far wall, a shock ran through me. In the glass, though now splintered, was a figure. Not a reflection of Holmes, not mine, a man tall and thin, standing where no one stood, still, watching. I yanked the spectacles off. "Holmes," I said, breathlessly, "there's someone in the mirror." "Or was I saw him too?" Holmes said quietly. His outline was faint, but unmistakable. Could it have been a projection? No, the lenses filter out ambient light. What we saw is what remains. A residual image? Possibly. A two-way mirror with light refraction? Perhaps. But Watson, this goes beyond sleight of hand. He took the glasses back and studied them. There's a chemical treatment on the lens edges. See the slight iridescence? Likely a polarizing filter combined with some form of photonic coating. Experimental, even by today's standards. This wasn't a theatrical prop. It was an instrument, calibrated to reveal what is otherwise hidden. Holmes stood. "We need to locate the route of these tunnels, the central point of control. If someone is observing, or has been observed, they left traces." By morning, the weather had turned foul. Rain pelted the ruined windows in angry sheets, and thunder rolled across the moors like a muttering god. Holmes, unbothered, led us back into the east wing, this time armed with twine, chalk, and a small compass he kept in his waistcoat. We marked our passage carefully, trailing twine through corridors, noting slight inclines, temperature shifts, and echo patterns. Holmes murmured to himself as we moved, tracing calculations in the air. At last, we reached a narrow service stair behind a false wall in the pantry. "Down!" Holmes said. "This is the heart of it." The steps descended in a tight spiral into a cellar space, unlike any I'd ever seen. There were no wine casks, no coal bins, only mirrors, dozens of them, some whole, some broken, some stacked against the walls like unused props in a forgotten play. All framed in that same green-veined marble. And in the far corner of the room sat an armchair facing a tall, intact mirror mounted to a copper bracket. On a nearby table lay a journal. Holmes approached it. "Watson, look at the name." I read the cover aloud. Horace Carmody. Holmes flipped open the first page. March 2nd. I can't explain it. I saw myself standing behind myself in the glass, not reflected, duplicated, and the second version? It smiled before I did. March 3rd. Alaric wasn't mad, he found something. A layer beneath perception. The lenses let you see it, but they don't let you unsee it. March 5th. I've tried to leave. I always end up back here. The house turns in on itself. Or I do. Either way, I've stopped trying. Holmes shut the book. "We were wrong, Watson," he said, his voice low. "Horace didn't vanish. He descended into this labyrinth, into madness perhaps, but also into someone else's experiment." I stared around the mirror-filled room. "But whose?" Holmes turned to the tall mirror on the bracket. It was the only one without a crack, and, unlike the others, it reflected us both. But as we stood before it, something changed. A second Holmes stepped into view, not behind my companion, but beside him. Identical in every way, but only in the glass. Holmes never moved, the reflection did. The figure in the mirror moved independently of Holmes. It was not a trick of timing or perception. I stood still, barely breathing, watching as the reflected Holmes in the mirror tilted its head to the left, hands calmly folded behind its back, while the real Holmes beside me remained perfectly motionless, eyes locked on the glass, jaw tense. It was Holmes in every visible detail, down to the crease in his lapel, the faint scar beneath his cheekbone, the peculiar way his fingers flexed when deep in thought. But it was not him. "Holmes," I said quietly, "are you seeing this too?" "Yes," he murmured, "and I'm not fond of what it implies." The mirror Holmes stepped forward, only in the glass. Not a sound in the room, no footsteps, no breeze, but the reflection leaned closer toward the inside of the frame, as if studying us in return. And then its mouth moved. It did not smile, it spoke. I saw the lips form the words, clearly, unmistakably. "You brought him." At last I recoiled, hand instinctively reaching for the revolver in my coat. But Holmes held up a hand. "Don't!" he said. "It's not alive." Or not in the way we understand. I looked back at the mirror. The figure was gone, replaced by our actual reflections, as if nothing had happened. Holmes stepped closer to the frame, running his fingers along the copper mounting. "It's not a hallucination," he said, "nor a simple reflection. This mirror is part of a constructed perceptual mechanism, one that responds to presence, perhaps even awareness." "A camera illusion?" I offered. "Or projection?" He shook his head. "Too sophisticated. Projection requires a light source. There's none. No hum, no glow, no emitter. This is something else, something I've never encountered before. The way the reflection anticipated our presence, spoke. It wasn't mimicking, it was observing." We stood in silence for a moment, the tension in the air sharp enough to slice through. Then Holmes knelt and examined the journal once more. Horace wrote of duplication. Not merely illusions, but split versions of the self. Psychological constructs, perhaps. But what if he was describing something more literal? "Do you mean to suggest this mirror creates some sort of duplicate?" "Not a clone," Holmes said slowly. "More like a visual echo, an impression that lingers and evolves independently. If Linthorne succeeded in capturing moments of the self through his lenses, fragments of behavior, thought, image, then what we saw may have been one such fragment, decoupled from reality." He closed the book. Or worse, someone's learned to inhabit the image left behind. The implications chilled me. "Holmes," I said, struggling to find steady ground in the conversation, "you're describing something dangerously close to spiritualism." "Not at all," he replied. "I am describing an advanced experiment in cognitive manipulation. This isn't the occult. It's optics and psychology applied to dangerous degrees." He stood suddenly and paced the perimeter of the cellar room, scanning the walls behind the mirrors. We need to know where the wiring converges. If we can find Linthorne's power source or his operating station, we might uncover the limits of this illusion. We located a hatch beneath the flooring, cleverly concealed beneath a fake crate. It led to a descending iron stair, half-rusted and coated in fine ash. As we descended, I felt the temperature drop further, as though each step pulled us away from the world we knew. The chamber at the bottom was small, no larger than a monk's cell, and dominated by a single control desk. Wires snaked in every direction. There was a switchboard of brass toggles, a set of adjustable lenses mounted on brass arms, and, remarkably, a phonograph-like horn connected to a reel of wire and a large metal spool. Holmes examined the switches. "It's a manual trigger mechanism," he said. Each mirror in the house was linked to this central hub. He could control what was seen and what was heard. He adjusted a few of the lenses and peered through them at a flat copper plate fixed to the wall. "This isn't photography," he said. "It's something like delayed exposure, projected not onto paper, but onto perception. These devices recorded not just light, but behavior, expression, presence, then reflected them back at will." He tapped the phonograph horn. "This explains the whispers, a mechanical voice loop, programmed responses to certain triggers, perhaps footsteps, shadows, voices, and the doppelganger?" Holmes paused, then looked me square in the eye. "That, Watson, is the one element I cannot fully explain. There may be recordings, yes, but somebody is still here, watching, intervening." As if on cue, a low clang echoed through the tunnels above. We both looked up. Booted footsteps, slow, purposeful, coming from the direction of the main house. Holmes extinguished the lantern. In the darkness, we listened as the intruder moved through the halls, pausing above us, then moving again. Not hurried, not cautious, confident. When the sound faded, Holmes relit the lantern. "We're not alone," he said. "And I no longer believe our mystery man is merely a relic of Linthorne's past. He is active, present, perhaps even expanding the experiment." We emerged cautiously into the cellar, passing again through the mirror room. The reflections were still, silent, watching. When we reached the ground floor, we found something new. A small envelope had been placed in the center of the grand foyer. Holmes picked it up. The paper was aged, but the ink was fresh. He unfolded the single page inside and read aloud. "Mr. Holmes, you are clever enough to see the cracks in the glass. But what will you do when the glass begins to reflect you back incorrectly? You have seen a version of yourself. It remembers you. Come alone to the mirror chamber at midnight. No tricks, no lights. If you want answers. A friend behind the glass." He folded the note with mechanical precision. "Well, Watson," he said at last, slipping it into his pocket, "the game is no longer afoot. It has begun watching its players. Will you go?" Holmes nodded. "Of course. But I won't be going unprepared." He stepped into the center of the shattered curio room, where the mirror had once stood tall. "The moment you allow your reflection to speak back, Watson, you must be certain it's still you speaking." It was 5 minutes to midnight when Holmes and I descended once more into the bowels of Linthorne Hall. The wind had risen outside, howling through the broken upper windows and rattling the loose shutters like the teeth of some ravenous beast. Rain lashed at the stone exterior, but within the crumbling manor all was oppressively still. Holmes walked ahead of me, his lantern unlit, his footsteps silent on the uneven floor. I trailed at a respectful distance, my revolver holstered, but my hand resting on the grip, my nerves coiled tight. He had insisted I remain near, but out of sight. hidden just beyond the threshold of the chamber in which the mysterious note had summoned him. We passed through the ruined west wing and down into the corridor of mirrors, each one now draped with cloths we had placed earlier that evening. Holmes had declared the reflections too volatile, too suggestive, to be left uncovered. The mirror chamber itself was unchanged. That tall, copper-bracketed mirror stood sentinel on the far wall, flanked by discarded frames and shards of green-veined marble. The journal of Horace Carmody still rested beside the armchair. But there was something new in the air, a smell like ozone and damp stone, faint but metallic, as though a storm were gathering within the house. Holmes turned to me as we reached the antechamber. "Stay here," he said softly. "No light, no sound. If anything goes awry, wait until the hour has passed. Then and only then enter. Holmes, this is madness," I whispered. "What if this man, or whatever he is, intends harm? I should remain with you." "I need to know how far this deception extends," he said, slipping the violet-lensed spectacles into his breast pocket. "If it is truly psychological, it must engage with me directly. You, Watson, are not a target. It has no reason to perform for you." He placed a hand briefly on my shoulder. "And if it does intend harm, I would rather you be in a position to end the play than to fall victim to it." I nodded unwillingly. With that, he stepped through the threshold and vanished into the chamber. I crouched just beyond the doorframe, heart pounding. Silence. Then, after a moment, the soft scrape of a chair being moved. Holmes must have seated himself before the mirror. Another pause, then a voice. At first I thought it Holmes's own, but something was wrong. The cadence was off, the tone too flat, the rhythm too rehearsed. "Sherlock Holmes." It was his voice, but not his voice. Then a second voice, Holmes's real voice, replied, low and steady. "You know me." "You are known," the imitation replied. "By what you see?" "And by what you deny." I felt the hair on my arms stand on end. Then came silence again. Holmes spoke once more, his voice tight. "You are not a reflection. You are a construct." The response was slower now. "I am what remains." The part discarded. "Then you are worthless," Holmes said coldly. "The residue of thought." "Or the record of intention," the mirror voice countered. "You are not here to solve. You are here to remember." Another pause. I risked peeking around the corner. Holmes sat perfectly still in the chair before the mirror. But in the glass I saw two Holmeses, both seated, both unmoving, but the reflection was wrong. The second Holmes had no lantern, no coat. His hands were resting in his lap, while the real Holmes's hands were folded beneath his chin, a small, almost imperceptible difference. Then the reflection blinked. The real Holmes did not. I froze. Holmes must have seen it too. He stood slowly. "So this is your trick," he said. "You mimic, then deviate. You leave the mind doubting what it ever believed true." The reflection rose in kind, but did not mirror him precisely. It raised its right hand when Holmes raised his left. Not a reflection, an imitation. Holmes reached into his pocket and produced a small object, a pocket watch. He held it up to the mirror. The reflection showed no watch. Holmes spoke calmly. "An illusion that fails to observe detail is no illusion at all. You're a shadow puppet, a memory, clever but incomplete." The figure in the mirror smiled faintly. "You gave me your shape, but not your doubts." "No," Holmes replied. "Those I keep for myself." Suddenly the mirror cracked. A long, jagged split shot down the center of the glass, without sound, without force. Holmes stepped back, startled. Then an object struck the ground with a clang, a ring. Holmes knelt and retrieved it. Even from the doorway I saw its distinctive glint. It was a signet ring bearing the Carmody crest. Holmes turned it over in his hand. Horace. The mirror dimmed. The figure inside faded. Then the voice spoke one last time. "He's still here." Behind the glass, waiting to be forgotten, and with that, the second Holmes was gone. I rushed into the room. "Holmes!" He stood unmoving, still staring at the now dim mirror. "I'm here," he said. "It's finished." I approached cautiously. "What did it say?" He opened his hand, revealing the ring. "It told me Horace is still alive." "And I believe it. You mean he's trapped, somewhere in the house, or in the tunnels, or in the network of illusion Linthorne built?" He turned to me with a strange look in his eye. "Watson, I believe this was all designed as a form of preservation, a way to store identity, not in journals, not in photographs, but in mirrors. Reflections as memory vaults, and the figure we saw, the duplicate, an echo, one of many. If Linthorne succeeded in creating reflections that diverge, then he may have unintentionally created inhabitants within them. If Horace was exposed to this technology long enough, he may have left something behind." He walked to the mirror and placed a palm gently against the cracked glass. "I intend to find him." At that moment, a new sound echoed through the house, a voice, not from the mirror but from above. It cried out in anguish, "Help! For God's sake, help me!" It was muffled, far away, but unmistakably human. Holmes turned to me sharply. "Come, Watson. We are not done here." The cry echoed once more through Linthorne Hall, raw, guttural, unmistakably human. It reverberated off the stonework like a desperate echo from the depths of a tomb. "Help! Please, someone—" Holmes was already moving. I followed close behind, my heart hammering as we ascended the staircase from the mirror chamber and burst into the ruined west corridor. The cry had come from above, somewhere near the crumbling servants' quarters, or perhaps from within the attic's shadowy reaches. The storm outside still raged, battering the high windows with relentless force, but inside the house there was only the sound of our footfalls and that single, aching voice trailing off into a moan. "Holmes," I whispered, "are you certain it's real? After everything we've seen?" He cut me off with a sharp gesture, too coherent for a playback device, too inconsistent. "This is not a loop, Watson. Someone is still alive." We reached the landing of the third floor. The plaster here had fared worse than in the lower levels. Great hunks had fallen from the walls, exposing beams beneath. Doorways stood ajar, their frames sagging like tired eyelids. The air was damp, fetid with rot and dust. "There," Holmes said, pointing to a set of double doors at the far end of the hallway. One was bolted shut, the other hung slightly open, swaying in the wind, leaking through a broken dormer window. Holmes drew his revolver. I unholstered mine. We advanced cautiously. As we approached, the cry rang. Out again. Closer now, more ragged. A single word. Police. Holmes pushed the door inward. The room beyond was surprisingly intact, a long, narrow space that might once have been a study or observatory. A single oil lamp flickered dimly in the corner, casting elongated shadows across the walls. In the center of the room stood an iron frame bed. On it lay a man. He was bound, ankles and wrists secured with lengths of stained cloth. A tattered blanket covered his lower half. His face was pale and unshaven, cheeks hollowed by days, possibly weeks, without adequate food. His hair, once fair, had turned grey at the temples, but his eyes were unmistakably those of Horace Carmody. He blinked at us, confused at first, and then hope bloomed. Are you real?" he croaked. Holmes holstered his revolver at once. "Yes, Mr. Carmody." "You are safe now." I rushed forward to undo the bindings while Holmes scanned the rest of the room. The windows were boarded from the outside, no visible furniture beyond the bed, the lamp, and a small table with a chipped teacup. "Watson," Holmes said, "check his pulse." I did, faint but steady. "He's malnourished, possibly drugged, but he'll recover." Horace licked his cracked lips. How long?" "At least 10 days, I replied gently. "Longer, perhaps." Holmes stepped to the bedside. "Mr. Carmody, listen carefully." "Who did this to you?" Horace's eyes darted to the far wall where the wallpaper peeled away like skin. "He said I had to stay. Said I had to see myself, that the real me was waiting." "Who?" Holmes demanded. "Who kept you here?" Horace shuddered. "Alaric." Holmes and I exchanged a glance. "Impossible," I said quietly. "Alaric Linthorne has been dead for over 2 years." "Is he?" Horace whispered. "He spoke to me. Through the mirrors. Said I had to stay until the experiment completed." "Which experiment?" Holmes asked. But Horace closed his eyes. "The mirror. Not a reflection. A portal. To the self you abandon." Holmes turned away, deep in thought. "This matches the journal entries. Linthorne believed that a person's reflection, observed under certain optical conditions, could become an independent psychological entity. He thought he could isolate the discarded self, the parts we suppress. And he trapped Horace here to test it? I believe Horace was both subject and observer. Left in this room, surrounded by mirrors, the mind fractures. Given enough sensory input and isolation, it begins to hallucinate. Or worse. To externalize, I look down at Horace. But if this was all a hallucination, why keep him locked in? Holmes's face darkened. Because someone else didn't want him to leave. Perhaps someone who knew the technology still worked and needed a witness who wouldn't be believed. He moved to the corner of the room where a cracked floorboard was. Slightly raised, he pried it up and revealed a small compartment. Inside was a spool of wire, magnetic tape, and another note. Holmes read it aloud. "He will speak to no one. He has seen too much. Let him rot until even his reflection forgets him." I remain behind the glass. No signature. Holmes folded the note carefully. "We're not dealing with a ghost, Watson. We're dealing with a custodian, someone who's kept Linthorne's technology alive long after its originator perished. Someone obsessed with the mechanics of identity, someone who may still be in the house." Holmes nodded grimly. "We must assume so." We carried Horace between us, slowly descending the staircase. He was weak, but conscious. Holmes kept his revolver drawn the entire time, eyes scanning each corner, each doorway, each looming shadow. The halls remained silent. No further voices, no more broken glass, no figure in the mirrors. When we reached the front foyer, Holmes turned to me. "We'll get him to safety," he said. "But tonight, we sleep in shifts." "I've no doubt we're still being watched." "Watched how?" I asked. He turned toward the cracked mirror we had uncovered earlier. "Not from behind the walls anymore," he said, "but from the echoes left behind." That night, as the storm faded and the house settled into uneasy quiet, Holmes sat in the center of the great hall, surrounded by draped mirrors with the Carmody signet ring in one hand and Linthorne's journal in the other. I drifted in and out of sleep, and once, only once, I awoke to see Holmes staring into a mirror we hadn't touched, one we hadn't covered, and in its depths I saw not his reflection but my own. Smiling, I was fully awake now. The reflection in the uncovered mirror across the foyer, my reflection, had smiled, though I had not. I sat wrapped in my travelling coat, half propped against the arm of a tattered divan, motionless. My breathing had stilled. Holmes, seated directly opposite me with his back to the mirror, had not seen it, but I had. And then my reflection blinked. Not with malice, not with animation, with awareness. I stood slowly. The cold stone beneath my boots felt suddenly unfamiliar, as if I had stepped out of time. My limbs moved like they belonged to someone else, every muscle inching forward against a tide of instinct telling me to turn back. Holmes remained still, cross-legged beneath a floor lamp, bathed in its weak glow. He had not noticed my sudden alertness. He had not seen the figure in the glass. But he spoke calmly, without turning his head. "What did it do, Watson?" I froze. "How did you—" "I heard you stop breathing," he said softly. "That's not something you do unless danger is present." He rose and turned toward the mirror. "Which one is it?" I pointed. Holmes approached the frame, eyes narrowed. The mirror was long and narrow, set into the panelling beside the main staircase, its frame made of plain pine rather than marble, perhaps part of the original house. It was not one of Linthorne's apparatuses. "Interesting," Holmes murmured. "A passive mirror, not wired, untouched by Linthorne's hands. Or so we thought." We stood before it side by side. The reflections mirrored us perfectly now. No errant smiles, no discrepancies. But the feeling remained. "You saw yourself smile?" Holmes asked. "Yes," I said, my voice barely audible. "And I did not." Holmes withdrew the violet-tinted spectacles and placed them over his eyes. After a long moment, he let out a low, contemplative breath. "I see nothing now," he said, removing them. "Which means the reaction occurred without the presence of Linthorne's filters. Which is far more troubling," I swallowed. "Do you believe it was real?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He turned and walked away from the mirror, then circled back and past it again, watching its surface closely from several angles. "I no longer believe we are dealing with simple memory projections," he said at last. "Something in this house, not just the devices, has taken on a life of its own, not supernatural, but autonomous, evolved." He looked back at me. "It is entirely possible that repeated exposure to Linthorne's mirrored experiments and the emotional energy of his victims created a sort of resonance, a pattern that continues to play out in the surfaces of the house. You're suggesting the reflections are acting independently?" "Not as sentient beings," Holmes clarified, "but as recursive echoes. Feedback loops caught in glass." He paused. "However," he added, "what concerns me more is that these echoes may be learning." A silence fell between us. In the adjacent room, Horace Carmody stirred from sleep on the makeshift cot we had prepared for him. I fetched him water while Holmes resumed pacing. The storm had finally passed, leaving the manor cloaked in a heavy stillness. It was the calm that comes not with peace, but with the eye of the hurricane. "Mr. Carmody," Holmes said gently, "I need you to try and recall something. In the days before you were confined to that room, did you ever engage with your reflection? Did it seem to respond?" Horace sat up slowly, eyes bloodshot, hands trembling. "Yes. The longer I stayed in the mirror rooms, the more different it became. I would speak aloud, sometimes to myself, sometimes just to hear something. Did it ever speak back?" Horace hesitated, then nodded. It would say things I was about to say, or had just thought. I blamed myself, lack of food, sleep, but eventually I stopped looking into the mirrors at all. Holmes frowned. "That's the difference, then. You fed it. I what?" "Attention is fuel, Mr. Carmody," Holmes said. "You stared too long, spoke too often. The reflection became an extension of your own fears, your discarded self, given enough reinforcement to manifest. Linthorne believed in this. He engineered it. I sat beside Horace. But why go to such lengths? Holmes began pacing again, hands behind his back. Because Linthorne wasn't just building devices. He was building containers, vessels not for light, but for identity. He stopped. And now the house has become a vault for those experiments. His subjects, over time, left behind more than just footprints and journals. They left psychic residue, emotions, repetitions, and some, like Horace, were never given the chance to forget. Suddenly a loud crash shattered the silence. It came from the corridor of mirrors. We rushed into the hall. One of the draped mirrors had fallen, cloth flung aside, frame cracked at the base, but the glass was intact. And in it we saw not ourselves. We saw Algernon Carmody. Holmes reacted first. "That's impossible. Algernon is in London," I stepped forward. The image was not still, it moved. Algernon was speaking, though we could not hear the words. His mouth opened and closed in rapid, distressed bursts, and then we saw him lean forward into his mirror. His hand pressed against the inside of the glass, as though he were trapped behind it. Holmes stood stock still, eyes wide. "It's a live relay," he said. "Someone is broadcasting from Carmody House." "A trap?" I asked. "No," he whispered. "A summons." Holmes turned on his heel. "Watson, gather your things. We're returning to London, but Algernon has been drawn into the reflection," Holmes said. "The process we feared has already begun. The house is replicating. The mirror in Mayfair may now function the same as those here." He turned to Horace. "We'll send someone for you. Remain here. Do not speak to the mirrors. Do not uncover them." He paused. "And do not answer if one calls your name." As we departed Linthorne Hall, I glanced once more into the cracked foyer mirror, the one I had seen smile at me. It was still there. But now there were two Watsons in the reflection, and only one of them turned to follow Holmes. By the time we reached London, the clouds had parted. It was mid-afternoon, and the sun cast a pale, watery light through the mist that clung to the streets like gauze. But the brightness offered little comfort. Both Holmes and I were silent during the ride from Paddington to Mayfair, our minds still clutched by the lingering grip of Linthorne Hall, its echoing corridors, its murmuring mirrors, and the impossible image we had seen. Algernon Carmody pressed against the inside of his own looking-glass. When we arrived at Carmody House, the butler, startled to see us, led us at once to the drawing-room. Algernon, he told us, had not been seen for several hours. The last time he had checked on his master, the door to the west parlour had been locked from within. He would not respond when I knocked.
"Sir," the man said, eyes flicking to Holmes, "I feared waking him, but—" Holmes nodded. "You did well not to force entry, but we must do so now we cross the hall to the ornate oak door." Holmes rapped twice, no reply. He gestured for a fire poker from the nearby hearth, then wedged it between the door and the frame. With a swift, sharp movement, he forced the latch and pushed the door open. The room was dim, curtains drawn, a low fire crackled in the grate, and across from the hearth stood the mirror the one Carmody had purchased from Linthorne's estate. It was whole, unshattered, and before it sat a high-backed chair, empty. I stepped inside. "Algernon!" No reply. Holmes moved swiftly to the sideboard and examined a small decanter and glass. The sherry had been poured, recently, still warm. No sign of spillage, no note. "No signs of struggle," Holmes murmured. "No departure, no indication of illness or collapse." I turned to the mirror and caught my breath. The room reflected perfectly. The curtains, the hearth, the fire, but not the chair. There was no chair at all. "Holmes," I said, "the mirror, it's not just emitting people anymore, it's emitting objects." He turned sharply. "You're right.
This is different. The dissonance is escalating. The mirror has begun choosing what it will acknowledge. He moved in front of the glass. It did not show him. I stepped forward. It showed me. Holmes slowly reached into his coat and retrieved the violet-lensed spectacles. He placed them on, then inhaled sharply. "Watson!" "Come here," I did. He handed me the spectacles. The world, tinted purple, fractured subtly around the edges. But then I saw it. Inside the mirror, beyond the fire and the furniture, there was movement. A room behind the room, a narrow corridor of darkness and flickering light, stretching impossibly far, and within it, figures, motionless, standing as though posed, hundreds of them, men and women of various ages and attire, some in 19th century garb, some more recent, all perfectly still, all gazing forward. None of them blinked. At the far end of the corridor stood Algernon Carmody, or something that wore his face. He did not speak, he only stared. Then as I watched, his mouth moved. I could not hear the words, but I could read them. "It remembers you." Holmes stepped beside me and whispered, "They're stored, Watson. Preserved somehow. Memory fragments, identities, souls. Call them what you will. Linthorne succeeded in building a vault of echoes. The mirror is the lock and the key." "But how is this possible?" I whispered. "How is Algernon inside?" "Not physically," Holmes replied. "He's still in this house, or was. But his reflection, his identity, was drawn in, overwritten by the construct he fed with fear." He paused. "Unless—" He moved back to the sideboard and inspected a small panel behind the mirror. "There must be a mechanism, a trigger. Linthorne's mirrors always had one. Chemical sensors, heat, sound." He tapped lightly around the frame. Then, click. A hidden drawer opened within the baseboard. Inside, a small vial of mercury, a pair of thin copper wires, and a folded note. Holmes opened it. His face darkened. "To reflect is to remember. To remember is to return. You saw yourself and fled. I stayed and became complete. Al_Alaric Linthorne," I said. "Or the entity that believes itself to be," Holmes replied. "He may have succeeded in something beyond even his own comprehension. Not just the preservation of memory, but its projection, replication." Holmes turned back to the mirror. The final experiment wasn't on others. It was on himself. Then from the hallway, footsteps, slow, deliberate, approaching. Holmes motioned for silence. We stepped to the side of the doorway, revolvers drawn. The steps paused just beyond the frame. Then Algernon Carmody stepped into the room. Or so it seemed. He looked pale, calm, eyes hollow. Holmes stepped forward. "Mr. Carmody?" he asked. The man blinked. "Yes, I think so. You think so?" I echoed. He looked to the mirror. I saw myself inside. I spoke. I don't remember what I said. Holmes studied him carefully. "You poured yourself a drink," he said. "Then you sat. Do you recall that?" "No." "Do you recall leaving the chair?" "No." Holmes stepped closer. "What's the last thing you do remember?" Algernon blinked slowly. "Someone calling me." Not aloud, but in the glass. He turned suddenly to Holmes. "I think I'm still there." We all looked to the mirror. There was no Algernon in the reflection, just Holmes and me. Holmes nodded. "It's begun decoupling entirely. The reflections no longer correspond to presence. The echo has taken hold," I whispered. "Then who is this man standing before us?" Holmes glanced at me. "We'll find out." He reached into his coat and removed the violet spectacles again, and handed them to Algernon. "Put these on," Holmes said. "Tell me what you see." Algernon hesitated, then placed them over his eyes. He stared into the mirror. His breath caught. "I see. Myself." We leaned in. "In a different room." It's in the mirror chamber in Cornwall, and he gasped. I'm smiling. He dropped the spectacles and staggered back. No, he said. That's not me. That's not me. He collapsed into the chair. Holmes knelt beside him, checking his pulse. He's lost cohesion, Holmes said grimly. His memory can no longer distinguish reality from reflection. I looked again at the mirror. The reflection of the room was gone. Now it showed only darkness and a single pair of eyes, unblinking, watching. Algernon Carmody had fallen into a deep, fevered sleep. We laid him upon the drawing-room settee and covered him with a blanket, while the fire crackled quietly beside us. Outside, the world had slipped into darkness once more, but the gloom inside the Carmody residence was thicker than shadow. It felt, no, pressed, like a presence all its own. Holmes stood before the tall mirror, hands clasped behind his back, his gaze locked not on his reflection, but on the absence of it. Only I was reflected now, the chair behind him, the fireplace, even the framed watercolours on the wall, all present. But Sherlock Holmes in that silvered pane had vanished once again. We're too late, he said quietly. I stood behind him. Too late for what? He turned slightly, the faintest quiver in his expression. The mirror no longer reacts to stimuli in real time. It has ceased to mirror altogether. It is now a window, or perhaps even a recording, looping something it has captured. Captured? I repeated. You mean Algernon? Holmes nodded. He fed it, spoke to it, projected into it, like Horace, like Linthorne before them. The mirror fed on repetition, emotion, fixation. It took their identities, their patterns, and began to generate its own. I looked again into the frame. Then what is this thing? A ghost? A psychological illusion? A machine gone mad? Holmes shook his head. Not mad. Evolved. This is the culmination of Linthorne's design. A mirror that does not reflect the surface of a man but his essence. A device that sees what is suppressed, ignored, or forgotten, and plays it back until the distinction between echo and original collapses. He paused. The creature behind the glass is not a man. Not any longer, but it knows enough to seem one. We stood in silence for a moment. Then Holmes said, "There's only one way to end this." I turned to him. "You're not going back to Linthorne Hall?" "No," he said. "We bring Linthorne Hall here." Before I could question him, he was already moving, downstairs into the cellar of Carmody House, a place I had never ventured. Holmes had visited it once weeks ago during a routine inspection for weak floorboards, but now he moved with precision, knowing what he sought. The room was cold and damp, filled with unused trunks, stacks of dusty ledgers and cobweb-covered wine crates. But near the eastern wall stood something I hadn't noticed before. A crate, long, coffin-shaped, stamped faintly with a name, L.H. Instruments, Marazion, Cornwall. Holmes pried the top open with a rusted crowbar. Inside, mirror fragments, copper wires, and a set of violet-tinted lenses, still wrapped in velvet. This, Holmes said, was the companion set to the mirror Algernon installed upstairs. A secondary unit, perhaps a failsafe, or perhaps the original. He handed me a square black box with a copper funnel affixed to the top. Acoustic relay, he explained. A primitive microphone, Linthorne's own. We connect it to the mirror's base and we restore the line of communication. I hesitated. Restore it? Why would we want that? Because we're going to speak to it, Holmes said grimly. One last time. By midnight, the assembly was complete. We had rewired the mirror base using the contents of the crate, carefully aligning the lenses and copper filaments with the housing concealed beneath the floorboard. The phonograph horn now protruded slightly from the side of the frame like a grotesque ear. Holmes had scrawled a circle of chalk around the base, covered all other reflective surfaces in the room, and dimmed the fire to a single low ember. I watched, unable to hide my anxiety, as Holmes seated himself before the mirror. This time I did not argue. "What do you hope to accomplish?" I asked. "I want to know what it wants," Holmes replied. "Whether it is conscious or merely a machine mimicking awareness. And if it is aware, then I must understand why it keeps calling to us." To me, he pressed a switch hidden beneath the frame. The horn crackled softly. Then, "You returned." The voice was not Holmes's nor Algernon's. It was soft, genderless, without echo, like breath on glass. Holmes responded evenly. "I never left. You sent others. But not yourself." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Who are you?" "I am who you see when you are not looking." "You are not me?" "No, I am what you left behind." A long pause followed. Then Holmes said, "You are an echo." Nothing more. The voice replied, "So were you." Once I felt a coldness wrap around the base of my spine. Holmes stared into the glass. "What do you want?" "Continuity." Another pause. "To survive." As all things do, reflected, remembered, rewritten. Holmes stood. "You cannot live in the mirror. You are bound to repetition. You are not real. Then why are you afraid of me?" At that moment the mirror surface shimmered, and then I saw him, Holmes, standing in the reflection, not seated, not facing forward. He was behind us in the drawing room, watching, but the real Holmes stood beside me. The figure in the glass smiled faintly. Holmes reached into his coat and produced a matchbox. He struck a match and held it aloft before the mirror. "Back away," he said softly. I did. He dropped the match onto the base of the frame. The copper wires caught instantly. Flames licked the edges of the glass. The mirror warped, first cracking, then bubbling like oil over flame. The voice shrieked, not with pain, but with static, as if 1,000 whispered memories were being torn apart. The face in the glass opened its mouth, and then it was gone. The mirror collapsed inward, the glass turning to ash. The frame splintered, the horn detached and struck the floor with a final metallic clang. We stood in silence, only the fire remained. Holmes breathed out. "It's finished." I nodded, or tried to, but something still felt wrong. I looked across the room, and there, on the far wall, was a small shaving mirror. I hadn't covered it. I looked into it, and saw two Holmeses, one standing beside me, the other just behind, smiling. For one long moment I could not move. The reflection in the small shaving mirror, no more than 10 inches across, remained fixed. The Holmes beside me stood perfectly still, gazing into the embers of the fire. But the other Holmes, the one in the mirror, smiled. It was not a natural smile. Not Holmes's usual wry smirk or sardonic half-laugh. No, it was curved, forced, a pantomime of human warmth, a mimicry. Then with deliberate slowness the figure in the mirror raised its hand and waved. "Holmes," I whispered, my voice hollow, "it's still here." He turned, saw my expression, and followed my gaze. The moment his eyes met the mirror, the second Holmes vanished, instantly, as if the act of being watched had broken the illusion. Holmes crossed the room, took a cloth from the armchair, and draped it over the glass without a word. "We missed one," I muttered. "No," he said quietly. "We left one, I suspect. It left itself." I stared at him. "What do you mean?" Holmes sat again, hands clasped, eyes far away. "When we destroyed the large mirror, we terminated its local conduit, the frame, the wires, the housing. But Linthorne's genius was not bound to a single piece of glass. He designed a system, a reflective circuit." He stood once more and paced. I believe that in its final moments, the entity, or echo, or whatever intelligence had gathered within those recursive layers, fragmented. It scattered itself across any remaining surfaces it could find, like a mind snapping under strain. Then, "It's not dead," I said. "No, not in the conventional sense, but it is incomplete." He paused. "Which makes it vulnerable?" I exhaled slowly. "Do you believe it can be destroyed entirely?" Holmes tilted his head. "Perhaps. But only if we destroy the design, the principle, and that will require more than hammers and flame." At that moment, a soft tapping echoed from somewhere above us. We both turned. 3 taps, deliberate, evenly spaced. Then silence. "Third floor?" Holmes said. "West corridor?" "Could it be Carmody?" I asked. Holmes gave a grim shake of the head. "No, he's still sleeping in the room below. I checked not 10 minutes ago." We retrieved our revolvers. The upper levels of Carmody House were far less adorned than the parlour floor. These had once served as staff quarters and storage rooms long since abandoned. The tapping had come from the west corridor, a narrow hall with faded wallpaper and a series of closed doors, each leading to forgotten rooms. Holmes paused before the last door on the left. He raised a hand. The tapping resumed, from within. He pushed the door open. It creaked on its hinges. The room inside was small, windowless, with low eaves and water-stained wallpaper. A single bureau sat in the corner, and on its surface was a mirror, round, no more than the size of a dinner plate, propped against the wall with a slight lean forward. Holmes raised the lantern. There was nothing reflected in the mirror, not him, not me, not the room, only blackness, a depthless void, like the lens of an unblinking eye. "I thought we broke the last one," I said. "We did," Holmes replied, "but this isn't part of Linthorne's original design." He moved forward, examining the bureau surface. "New dust marks. The mirror was placed here recently." He turned it slightly. The blackness inside swirled for a moment, as if disturbed. "Someone set this here intentionally. A survivor. You mean someone is still feeding it?" Holmes's face was unreadable. "Or studying it!" A low vibration passed beneath our feet, barely perceptible, like the tremor of a passing train. I gripped my revolver more tightly. Then, from the black mirror, a voice, quiet, close, inside our skulls. "Not yet finished." Holmes acted immediately. He stepped forward and smashed the mirror with the butt of his revolver. The glass cracked once, twice, then shattered inward like a broken lens. The shards scattered across the bureau and floor, glittering like ice. The vibration stopped. We waited. Nothing more came. Only silence. Back downstairs, Algernon Carmody had stirred. His skin had taken on colour again, his speech steadier. Holmes gave him tea, and we waited as he gathered his thoughts. "I remember everything," Algernon said quietly. "Every moment inside, but not physically, not the room. It was as if I had become part of a film, watching myself through the eyes of another." "Reflected memory," Holmes murmured. "Replayed endlessly. A mental theatre designed by Linthorne." Algernon looked up, frightened. "It's over, isn't it?" Holmes paused. "For you, yes." "For now, and for the rest of it?" Holmes did not answer. Instead, he stood and turned to me. "We must seal the Carmody mirror. The original frame is still dangerous. You believe it's still active?" "I believe," Holmes said slowly, "that fragments of identity, of echoes, do not die as easily as glass. They find other ways to persist. In reflections, in memory. Perhaps even in us." I said nothing. He walked to the hearth and retrieved a small iron poker. Without ceremony, he walked to the mirror we had repaired earlier in the week, the one that had shown him missing. With 3 sharp thrusts, he broke the glass. It fell inward, not with a crash, but a soft implosion, like breath exhaled, through clenched teeth. He looked to me. I believe the last window is closed. We took our leave of the Carmodys that evening. Holmes instructed Algernon to remove all reflective surfaces from the house. Not superstition, he explained, but as a precaution against memory that refuses to be forgotten. As our cab rattled away from Mayfair, Holmes remained silent. Only when we crossed into Baker Street did he finally speak. "I have seen many men deceive," he said, "and many illusions pass for truth. But never before have I encountered something that so expertly blurred the line between being and seeming." I nodded. "Do you believe Linthorne's work has truly ended?" "No," he replied softly, "but I believe its mirrors will become less precise. The more light we shine into them, the less they have left to reflect." As we ascended the stairs to our familiar rooms at 221B, I caught a glimpse of us both in the hallway mirror. Holmes paused. I did too. The reflection stared back. Identical in every way, but for the first time in days I felt certain they belonged to us. And just as I turned to leave, I saw Holmes raise a finger and touch the glass. "I see you," he said quietly, "but only when I allow it.